We've made it to the last pose of Sun Salutation A, Adho Mukha Svanasana, Downward Facing Dog. Downward Facing Dog is often referred to as a resting pose, but I'm going to tell you this, it is most definitely a strength pose. The goal is certainly to be able to find a sense of calmness and rest and ease within the pose, but it will never be as restful as, say, child's pose. We are holding ourselves up with a lot of weight in our hands as we push through the shoulders to push our hips back behind us. So very much strength pose, shoulder strength being used here, shoulder mobility as our arms are up over our head. We enter downward facing dog from upward facing dog. And just like in upward facing dog, we had two ways to enter it. We can enter downward facing dog in two different ways as well. You could flip one foot at a time and push back to downward facing dog, or you can roll over your toes and find your way into downward facing dog. Whichever you find to be most comfortable for you is the way to go. And you'll notice I did step my feet in a little. You can definitely step your feet in when you come into downward facing dog. You don't have to be as wide as your plank. You don't want to have a super narrow down dog, but you can step in just a little bit. Now, some things to note in downward facing dog. Bend your knees so that you can draw your hips and your tailbone back. You'll feel that this lengthens out your torso. From there, straighten your legs at least as much as you're able. Draw your heels straight back and down. They don't have to touch. Press firmly through the base knuckles. So those are the knuckles at the base of your fingers, especially the one at the base of your pointer finger. Use that to move your body back. Bend your elbows slightly out to the sides. This will give you the space to then turn them underneath you and straighten them out. You want your elbows underneath you, your triceps wrapping towards your ears for external rotation through your shoulders. And then push down, like I said, through those knuckles. You'll notice that your shoulder blades, they do come up slightly. They're not elevated all the way up by your ears, but you also don't want them all the way back down towards your hips. Then, lastly, consider where your neck is. Make sure it's in line with the rest of your spine. Downward facing dog. A couple of things tend to happen. We will either sometimes go too deep into our shoulders, or we won't actually go deep enough and have the angled line that we want. So sometimes if we are, especially if we're hypermobile, we'll end up doing this in our downward facing dog and really dropping our chest. And if that feels good for you, certainly you can do that a little bit, but I wouldn't hold my downward facing dog that way. And then another thing that we might sometimes do, kind of the opposite of that, is that we don't actually bring our hips back as far as we should. And we're more kind of partway between plank and partway between downward facing dog. Something else to think about when you're in your downward facing dog are your feet. Sometimes we try so hard to lower our heels that we end up collapsing through our arches. So first of all, your heels don't have to touch, but to make sure that you're staying active through your feet, press down firmly through your big toe mounds to help keep your arches nice and active so they don't collapse. And then the last thing I want to show you a little more closely is what I was talking about before with the shoulder blades and how we don't want them depressed down because we are trying to push the ground away. We're pushing our bodies back towards our hips slightly. And when you push up overhead like that, your shoulders do lift some. So let's take a look at that. when you're in downward facing dog, sometimes if we really are trying to make it a resting pose, we end up kind of like this. Our elbows are slightly bent and they're bending out to the side. Our arms are internally rotating in the socket. Our shoulder blades are all the way depressed down our back towards our hips, and our head is hanging super low towards the mat. If you find you're doing this in your downward facing dog, first step, take those elbows, draw them underneath you to externally rotate your shoulders. Straighten them out, push down through the knuckles at the base of your fingers. You notice that your shoulder blades, they will lift from here. They will lift some as your body comes up in line more and your head moves away from the mat. You don't need to have them all the way elevated by your ears, but again, we want to avoid having them down here. It's really hard to push away when we're not actually using our shoulders to help with the pushing. So push through your shoulders, slight elevation, upward rotation, external rotation, all happening in our shoulders. Since that is it for Sun Salutation A, next we will be looking at chair pose, Utkatasana.